Hello and welcome to Chess with Ivan. Today's video has one very important objective, which is to help you as an improving chess player to confidently win every time you have a king and a rook versus the enemy's lone king. And it is a very common endgame, it happens very often, but if you don't know the proper technique, it could be a bit frustrating chasing the enemy's king all over the board and not quite being able to land the checkmate that you want. And since you're here, you're in luck, because watching this video will save you much time in the future when you are in this position and you know what to do in order to win. So let's see what we need to do in order to win every time we play this king and rook versus king endgame. The first thing you need to know when you're facing an endgame is kind of envision where you want the enemy king to be in order to give them a checkmate. A lot of beginning players might not know what are the necessary steps to do in order to even give a checkmate with these pieces. So, to save you some time again, I'll just tell you that the enemy king has to be on one of the four edges of the board. And the reason for that is that a king and the rook alone don't have enough firepower in order to checkmate a king when they're somewhere in the middle of the board. Because a king can move in 8 different directions, and a king and a rook together cannot cover all of these 8 squares and give a checkmate to the enemy king. It's just too much for them. What they can do, however, is give a checkmate when the enemy king is on the edge of the board, because that king is restricted. Since it cannot go outside the board, it has less options where to move, and then our king and rook can indeed deliver checkmate. So let's first see what happens when the enemy king is already on the edge, and then we'll learn how to get them in this situation. In this basic position that you see now, if it was our turn to move, we just simply give checkmate. I will show it now so that you envision what you need to do every time you are in this position, how a checkmate looks like. It will always look as some variant of that. So the rook goes down to the same line as the king, or the same rank, checks it, basically saying you have to move from this rank because the rook is controlling every single square on it, and our king is helping by blocking each of the 3 options for the enemy king to go forward. And that's all there is to it. However, if it wasn't our turn, let's say that the starting position is big, but it's black's turn to move. So obviously our enemy doesn't want to get checkmated, and the way for them to not be checkmated is to move and break this sort of alignment that you see with the kings. So for example, they'll go here on e1. Now if we check them, it is not checkmate because our king still controls 3 squares. Their king still can go to 3 squares, but they're not the same 3 squares. So in this case, the enemy king can escape. So we don't want that to happen. So what we want to do is, before coming down with the rook, make sure that when we do, the 2 kings are aligned, which means there is no escape for the black king. So what we need to do is see which way the enemy king is going. So for example, if they go now to d1, what we need to do is take our rook all over the other side of the king. So now when they again are to move, if they go towards the rook, they will align the kings. We want our enemy to do the work for us and align the kings, so that when it's our turn, we don't move our king and break this nice alignment. We just come down with a rook and give checkmate. So the enemy now knows they can't go back to e, so they'll go further left to c, but we just keep chasing them, and anytime they kind of change direction, we will checkmate them. For example, if they change direction now, we just go to h1 and checkmate. If they keep running away, at some point, lucky for us, the board ends, so they will have to go back. In this case, king went all the way to A, there is no letter before A, so they have to go back to B. And now the kings are aligned and it's our turn, meaning that we win with a nice checkmate. Just one more example, because our opponent does not have to go away, towards the rook. You saw if it goes towards the rook, just to recap, we go all over on the other side of our king. And then they know that now going towards the rook will result in a loss. But if they move away from our rook, so in this case if they go to g1, Again, the kings are not aligned, so we shouldn't check now with the rook. We should do a waste of time move, so we give the initiative back to our opponent. So here we just move slightly from A to B. Now it's their move. So again, if they move towards the rook, we can give checkmate. So they'll probably go to H. We again move towards them with the king. And now they've run again out of squares, so they have to move towards the rook, aligning the kings. And this is when we know that we can confidently give checkmate, in this case from B1. And that's everything you need to know. So let's recap what we need to do in order to checkmate very quickly. First of all, use our rook to be on the second last rank, so that we know that that king can never go forward. And then use our king and rook in a way to force our opponent to align the kings together, and then give checkmate. So, how to get from a regular position that can happen at any time on the chessboard into this winning situation on the back rank? Well, there isn't that much difference. Let's imagine for a second that the king, which is currently on the third rank, is actually on the last rank. So for example, now we can just give it a little check with the rook. We know that it cannot go up to the fourth one and hover around in the center because our king is blocking, so it will have to go back to the second rank. Again, we apply the principle that our rook is cutting the enemy king from going up, so the enemy king is now forced to stay on the second or even go back to the first rank, which means that we just use our king as a way to prevent the king going forward. We look for an alignment of the kings. They might try and waste time as before, and ultimately they will run out of squares, meaning that at the very end of the board they'll have to go back, align the kings, and we give a check. So it's all about rinsing and repeating the same principle that I showed when the rook was, the enemy king was on the back rank. You just need to do it a few times, but ultimately now we see that we have reached an endgame position that will be very, very quickly won. A final thing, just if that looks very tedious, is let's see this starting position where it started. So here, the enemy king is on the fifth rank. It would be a bit boring and tedious and really not fun to rinse and repeat this technique we just learned 5 times, unless you're really into practicing. But a better way to do it is to remember that the chessboard has 4 edges, and in this case the enemy king is already on the edge on the H kind of file. So instead of going down with our king and rook, we can see how to cut it off and keep it on the H file. So a bit of geometry helps. We put it on the G file, and now that king is absolutely blocked from going forward. And what we do is we use our king in order to chase the enemy king and force it to align itself with our king. In this example, I tried as hard as possible with black to resist, but ultimately at some point you will just have to align the kings and allow white to checkmate you. That's really everything I wanted to say about this checkmate. I hope it made sense. If you have any questions here or want to improve your technique, just comment below. And good luck. I hope you win every single game you ever have where you have a king and a rook against an enemy's lone king. Thanks a lot for watching. Bye.